All right. Thanks everyone for joining. So I'm Jared Alexander, and today I'll be talking to you about building DevCommunity.org in Flutter Web. And first, I do want to address, Web Talk at an Android conference. So my background is heavy in both iOS and Android development, and a lot of what we'll talk about applies to Flutter, not only running on web, but also on iOS and Android. And my hope is to, inspire existing Flutter devs. I know there's been some other Flutter talks at the conference to attempt to build and run their apps on Flutter Web. And if you're new to Flutter and you never considered building for the web, you might find Flutter to be kind of an attractive option when building out your next app. And of course, getting that Flutter, like that web support for free is a pretty amazing thing. And lastly, even if you don't want to use it for your mobile app, you can use Flutter Web, for example, to build a promotional website for your application. So a little bit about me. I'm a team lead over at Capital One, working on the Capital One mobile app. So I have iOS and Android teams working on a lot of the rewards features. If you've used any of those, if you're a Capital One customer. And outside of work, spend lots of time with family. Have a 9-month-old. Keeps me really busy. I love teaching and knowledge sharing, which is why I'm here. Basketball, lots and lots of Netflix, especially due to the pandemic. And of course, tinkering with new tech, which includes Flutter and now Flutter Web. Previous to Capital One, I actually used to teach iOS and Android development at George Washington University for about 6 years. So that was super rewarding and really, really just an awesome experience. So that's just a little bit about me. And that photo was taken at Lake Anna down near Fredericksburg, Virginia. So first, I want to start with why I believe in cross-platform. Of course, there are many challenges with building experiences across iOS, Android, and web. And building 3 times, it can't be the most efficient way to do things. During my career, I think a lot of what I've seen is just the high risk and actually the realization that we do have a lot of inconsistencies across our platforms. These are different teams with different devs building similar experiences. We end up having inconsistent UI and inconsistent business logic, which can lead to bugs and potential risk for customers and users of our applications. So of course, benefits to using sharing code. I think most of you are aware of this, but solve things like not only writing our business logic, our UI, but things like localization, testing, accessibility, and more. And by just implementing that once. And the hope is, can we use this save time to either build more features, devote more time to innovation or innovative features, or add additional UI polish like animations. And that's actually something Flutter makes it really easy to do. And of course, if you find a bug, fix it on all the platforms. The flip side of that is you introduce a bug, you introduce it to all 3 platforms, but I prefer to talk about the former. And of course, platform-specific code has its place. We have Android-specific features and UI paradigms, and we need to take advantage of the latest and greatest on iOS and Android, things like home screen widgets on iOS, Android instant apps. So Flutter, definitely can't solve for everything, but I think it is a really good solution and something that should be considered going forward. So first, some advice. Before we jump into the tech details, working hard for something we don't care about is called stress. Working hard for something we love is called passion. So I found this quote recently, and really what I want to ask the group or the call is do you have a passion project? And we can read books, watch videos, attend Android summits, but really nothing can replace that hands-on experience. And I know we're all busy, especially during these times. But really, try to find that time and think about something in your life or something that impacts someone that and try to build some kind of tech solution to solve it. And what I traditionally try to do is, hey, what's some new tech out there? I try to solve some kind of personal problem with new tech. And that's kind of how I motivate myself to find that time, because I'm trying to solve or fix some kind of personal problem, and using some kind of new framework, language, library is kind of my vehicle to get there. And I find that's a super motivating thing. If we go back to 2011, that's kind of where I got my start in mobile development. And I wasn't able to do it on the job, so I had to spend time outside of work. And really my big jump into mobile was I was engaged, and we wanted a really cool mobile app for our wedding guest. And so this is my first jump into mobile dev, and definitely learned a ton. And you can tell this is a quite dated application. I also rebuilt it in Android as well. But it was used by over 800 weddings. We opened it up to kind of the general public across the U.S. And it was just a really great experience in learning. And I would call this passion project like it's responsible for my career in mobile dev. So, and then the other piece of advice, teaching is the best way to learn. So that's part of the reason I'm up here. So sharing what you learn is really a forcing factor in achieving your kind of goals and learning goals. So whether you're presenting at a conference or meetup, lunch and learn, writing a blog post, typically when you do those things, you tend to spend more time understanding the basics and the foundations, so that if you get tough questions, or you want to have these good explanations in these talks, you kind of spend that extra time to get familiar with things. And so since submitting this talk, I spent countless hours like improving this website that I built out, so I can more proudly and confidently share my knowledge. And definitely not an expert on Flutter yet, and definitely not on Flutter Web. But the work that I've done has come a really long way since the original prototype. And really, I owe you, the audience, for kind of, by signing up for this and getting it accepted. Like, it's really pushed me to make the UI better, make the code better, and it's all open source on GitHub if you want to check it out. So what is DevCommunity? It's a website. This was the original version, and as I mentioned, it may not look night and day, but it's much better today than it was when I first started. So prepping for this talk has really helped me kind of push myself to improve things, and a lot of what you're seeing is not visible. I worked really hard to make it responsive across mobile devices, tablets, and desktop. And also worked with a friend to kind of just improve the design a bit. So what is DevCommunity? So it's a family of meetups supporting our community through learning events aimed to inspire and accelerate developer growth. So right now it's pretty focused in the DC area. You can see those logos on the right: DC iOS, DC Android, DC Flutter, DC Kotlin, Cloud DC, and GDT GC. We try to kind of focus on mobile web and cloud development, but we're not super restricted to that. And of course, speakers are welcome, so you can actually sign up to speak on the DevCommunity website that I just showed you. Why the website? We wanted a way to kind of like bring our family of meetups together. So highlighting, what meetups are coming up next. We want to highlight the recordings from our YouTube channel, because we do record all our talks. Make it easy for the community to volunteer to speak. We're always looking for speakers. And then we have a newsletter that we send out, so we're trying to also drive some newsletter signups. And building that website, I totally could have used some kind of bootstrap template, but where's the fun in that? As I mentioned earlier, it's, I think, pretty powerful and rewarding to use these kind of hobby passion projects to experiment with new stuff. So that's why kind of the push into Flutter Web. So a quick live demo. This is what it looks like. On the right side, this has we only have one upcoming meetup. Typically this list is longer. And then here kind of pulls recent videos from our YouTube channel. And a lot of this, the more videos links out to YouTube. Each one of these links out to the meetup page for the meetups that we are part of our family. And then of course we have the newsletter sign up, ability to volunteer to speak, link to our Twitter, and contributing on GitHub. We definitely take pull requests, and if you have ideas for improvements, let us know. So on the surface, this might look simple, but I use this as an opportunity to kind of dive deeper into Flutter. In the past, I focused more on getting the Hello World up and running, but in building this website out, I also focused on how does integration testing work in Flutter? How does accessibility work? How does localization work? So things that are past the Flutter 101, even though you may not see them on the surface, I did spend a lot of time on that, and we'll talk about some of these topics in this talk. As with Flutter, one of the cool benefits is the ability to make a change and kind of see it instantly. So for example, if I were to change the accent color to red and save, you'll notice the page refreshes, and that is a difference between Flutter Web and Flutter Mobile, is that on Flutter Web you get a hot reload, or sorry, a hot restart, which means the page did refresh, but if you notice, the button is now red. Another pretty cool thing is there's a Flutter plugin called Device Preview. So if I turn this thing on, it really helps me to kind of test the responsiveness of the website. And at the bottom, you can see I can actually pick templates. And I know Google Chrome Developer Tools does some of this, but this also does things like easily switching between different languages and locales. testing some accessibility, light versus dark modes. It's a cool tool and something really easy to bring into your Flutter projects, whether you're doing Flutter Web or Flutter Mobile. So I'm going to flip that back off. All right, so talking about the tech stack, so it's built out in Flutter Web using Firebase on the back end. You notice there was some data that we were displaying. One was upcoming meetups, and two was videos from our YouTube channel. So we have to get that data from somewhere. So on the Firebase backend, we use Firebase Functions to basically fetch the data on a regular basis. Because that data is not changing all the time, rather than make those API calls to Meetup and YouTube every time the page is hit, we just like 4 times a day grab that data and basically cache it into a JSON file and store it in Firebase storage. And when the website loads, it kind of pulls it down from there. Something else that's been pretty fun to experiment with is GitHub Actions. If you all aren't familiar, basically the idea is the project's configured in a way where when I push up commits for the project, it will basically do an automatic build on GitHub and then a deploy. So within about 2 minutes, every commit that I push up becomes live on devcommunity.org, which I think is a pretty cool thing. That was my first time using GitHub Actions. So why Flutter Web? I mentioned a little bit earlier, but I was already experienced in Flutter Mobile and kind of done the basic Hello World things, but I didn't yet have kind of like a concrete use case or application to build. So this I felt was like a good opportunity to learn and something we could publish pretty quickly and get out there and kind of solve the problem we had around like how do we kind of market and this family of meetups called DevCommunity. From a Flutter perspective, as I mentioned, build with a purpose, publish. But also, even though it's only published on web, it's built in a way where if I wanted to publish on Google Play or the App Store, I could do that without a full rewrite, which I think is a pretty powerful thing. Another note, CSS is my enemy. So back in the day, I did do some web dev, and I was so happy to get into mobile dev back in 2011, and I kind of never looked back. But really, Flutter Web is just, to me, an opportunity to get back into web dev, and do it in a way where it doesn't require a whole new kind of paradigm to build it out. One quick note, if you want to experiment with Flutter Web, it is only available in the beta channel, so it's not yet ready for prime time, but Google's working very hard and updates are coming out all the time to make improvements to both Flutter, mobile, and web. Why Firebase? I think a lot of you, especially, this is Android Summit, are probably familiar with Firebase, but super developer friendly. I always like to call it a developer's best friend. The free tier was definitely enough for the use case for the site. We're not getting a ton of traffic, and that's okay. And our goal is to, we'll continue to build it out and grow it. And I already was experienced in it. So the architecture, our Flutter clients, which right now is web, just pulls down a JSON file from Flutter storage. But there is a Firebase function that will pull Meetup calendar feeds and the YouTube channel for DevCommunity to kind of populate that data on the website. So this is Firebase Functions. This runs every 6 hours, not super interesting. Those are some log statements, but ultimately, it's just JavaScript. If you haven't used Firebase Functions, you write some JavaScript. If you've done Node.js, you'll feel right at home. And it writes to that api.json file. That data, meetup.com just has an iCal file that I can pull in. YouTube has an XML file. So all that kind of mashes together and becomes kind of the API for this application. And that's just what the JSON looks like. So CI/CD, so in GitHub, I mentioned GitHub Actions. So there's a YAML config file. So when I do push up commits, it's configured in a way where it'll take my Flutter project and publish it to GitHub pages. And then we have the devcommunity.org domain mapped to a GitHub pages. And that's just what the YAML file looks like for Flutter Web. And I think I borrowed this probably from a Medium article. Medium is becoming one of my best friends for development. Stack Overflow is good too, but Medium's just become such an amazing resource for learning and getting up to speed on new stuff. So project walkthrough, I'm not sure, feel free to click the little hand raise button if you've used Flutter before. Anyone in the room? Don't see any yet, and you might also be looking for the little hand raise button. All right, well, seems like not many. But ultimately, code's written in Dart. This isn't meant to be like a Flutter 101 how-to type talk. But generally, you know, I have some API networking code, my model objects, and my localization, which we'll talk about later, my strings file, basically. And most importantly, you know, when you hear Flutter, you should think widgets, right? So all those UI components you saw, like we have a card per meetup, we have like a card per video recording, we kind of that hero image in the middle with like a description of who we are. All those things are considered widgets. So I've kind of broken out all these UI components into Dart files to kind of split out the UI so that they become more kind of reusable components. So, you know, just a peek into what does Dart code look like and how might you build a UI component. There was a Jetpack Compose talk earlier. Honestly, I feel like, you know, between iOS and Swift UI, Android and Swift and Jetpack Compose, and then Flutter with its declarative UI, all the mobile platforms are kind of like merging together from like a how they work perspective. So this header is just a text widget, and then this nice little like blue accent divider. This is what the code looks like, for example, for this very simple widget. You can see we have a column with a text widget and then a container with a divider, just to give you all a preview of kind of what the code looks like behind it. From a testing perspective, widget test holds any widget test that you've built out, and then test driver is for your automation test or integration test. So I did experiment a little bit with that, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then you have configuration. So this is my localization configuration file. And then pub spec is kind of where your any third-party libraries that you bring in, you spec them out there. There are also folders in your project that are for specifics for iOS, Android, and web. So in iOS, there's actually an Xcode project. In Android, there's actually an Android Studio project. And in web, there's simply an HTML file. And just to give you a heads up on like how much like HTML specific code I had to write, really all I did was go into the auto-generated HTML file that the Flutter Web project provided and updated some of the icons here for like when you save a website to your home screen, or when you think about like the fave icon in your browser. That's really the only updates I made, besides also giving the web app a title that's displayed when you go to your browser. So how do you do blank in Flutter? So from a testing perspective, here's some more Dart code. Once again, I know a lot of you haven't used Dart or Flutter, but ultimately a feature is a way to kind of like make a asynchronous call, and in my case, it's a API call. So I have a very simple test where once I pull that API.json, which has my meetup, my upcoming events, and my previously recorded videos, either, you know, the API call is successful and I return a widget that includes kind of the core window or the core content for my website, or otherwise I just return a blank container. Yeah, you know, no, this isn't ideal for like a real website. I probably need to put some kind of error messaging here, but ultimately notice that I add a key to my content widget, and that key is kind of what I look at when I'm testing to see in my automation test, did this API call correctly execute, and then we got data back. So if you look at what an integration test might look like in Dart, I have a test that makes sure that API comes back successfully. And so what I'm doing is using the await keyword and looking for the home screen content key. If I see that, if it exists, then I assume then yes, like my API call successfully ran. Otherwise, I assume that it failed. So that's a very simple example, but I just wanted to, you know, preview some code around like what an integration test, a very simple one, might look like in Dart and Flutter. And remember, this same code applies to, you know, Flutter running on mobile devices as well. So hopefully you see some benefit there of not having to have 3 separate automation stacks for testing out your applications across iOS, Android, and web. I did notice an inconsistency on web. So as throughout this presentation, I'll continue to highlight some of the gaps that I've found in experimenting on Flutter Web. So when I ran the test, I purposely screwed up the API so it would fail. So on iOS and Android in Flutter, that test failed. However, on web, it passed no matter what. So I have some further investigation. Flutter Web is beta. So it's, as I mentioned, it's not fully baked yet. But that is just one highlight of something I noticed as a gap between Flutter Web and Flutter Mobile. So it's kind of telling me things passed when it shouldn't have. From a localization perspective, Flutter 1.22.0 came out recently, and they actually made some really great improvements to how localization works in Flutter. Google had some opinions about how to do it, but it wasn't necessarily baked into your Flutter workflow. You kind of had to take the advice and then implement it manually. More recently, Google has basically taken their opinions and made updates to their Flutter plugin so that it will auto-generate your kind of boilerplate localization code. So all you do is kind of update your ARB file, which is kind of like a strings XML in Android. And then it will update your localization boilerplate code so you can access those strings in a strongly typed way. So for example, this is what the project hierarchy looks like. There's my English ARB file. Notice that it actually forces you not only to give it the string, but also a description. You actually cannot leave out the description, which is kind of annoying, but at the same time, I think is a pretty helpful thing to have context when you're having things translated. And so what you'll notice is that what they're going for is they're able to, you're able to auto-generate this file, and this is kind of what you access when you're writing, building out your UI. So ultimately, when I'm in my UI code, if I want a menu button to have a certain title, I make a call like this, app localizations, and then I just access the .about, and that will give me my string. If the locale is set to English, it'll be in English. If I had a second file, maybe a Spanish version, I'd have another ARB file, and it would automatically pick the right translation based on the language, just like on Android. Accessibility. So this topic, at least several months ago, I heard this was a huge gap for Flutter Web, and it looks like things have improved here. This is the first time I experimented with it, but I did get it to work. But there were a few Flutter Web specific issues. So by default, Flutter Web apps do not have accessibility turned on. So the user who may have a hard time seeing actually has to turn on accessibility for the Flutter Web app, which I don't think is really the right way to go about it from a user experience perspective. Typically, I think you would expect to go to the website and use your screen reader just as is. But I think based on what I read, and there's an issue, there's tons of very well-tracked GitHub issues, which is really great. I think there's a really large amount of transparency within the Flutter dev community and from the Google side. So typically you can find an issue already and a lot of commentary back and forth to see kind of what's going on, but ultimately it's due to performance issues. So I would guess once Flutter comes out of beta, those will be resolved. But for now, you actually have to, as a user, turn on, there's like a invisible button to turn on accessibility that your screen reader needs to hover on. So how to make accessibility work in your app. So by default, things like text are read out loud, but there's this thing called a semantics widget. And this is how you might set things like labels, hints, and values. So for example, if you had an image that you wanted to add like a content description, you can do that using a semantic widget. Additionally, if there's something you think doesn't make sense to be read out loud, you can actually exclude an element from the accessibility tree using the semantics widget. So this is what it looks like. If you think about the Flutter web page, so I have this image here. I call it like the hero image. So I do want to describe this. So I have a localized string called hero image semantic label. And when like a screen reader goes over this, it will read the description that I provided out loud. So let's jump into some Flutter Web specifics. So as I mentioned, whether you're doing Flutter on mobile, if you're doing Flutter on mobile, it's actually really simple to get started on web. It's just a matter of switching over to the Flutter beta channel and then changing your run target to Chrome web. Really, really easy. And with web, it's true for mobile as well. We need to think about different screen device sizes. But for Flutter Web especially, we need to think about responsive design. How does this work on mobile web, desktop web? And then of course, if we run this thing on iOS or Android, we'd like it to look nice there too. So there's this thing called media query, which folks might be familiar with if they do standard web development, but it's basically a way to check things like screen size, orientation, the parent widget size that a child widget is within. So it's a really helpful way to kind of like inspect and understand the display that your content is being shown on. And so I actually spent a lot of time figuring out the right way to do this. And I'd say there's no perfect way to do it. There's a lot of opinions, and there are some third-party libraries that exist, but I decided to kind of not do those because I was trying to not bring in another dependency, and I wanted to keep it really simple. So this is what some code function I have basically that looks at the media query data, and then based on the device width is my simple way to kind of separate desktop versus tablet versus mobile. Is this the best way? Maybe not, but I'm still evolving in it. It seems to work pretty good for my use case. And as you saw earlier in the live demo, as I resized, I think it performed pretty well. On my main screen, which is just a single page web app right now, I kind of simplified my workflow. So either it's the desktop version of my UI or the mobile version. I don't do much to cater to tablets. That might be an improvement that I make in the future. But right now, basically, when I render my UI, either it's a desktop version, which is kind of more width focused, or it's a more mobile version, which is more like height focused. And in your Flutter code, as I mentioned, everything is a widget. You can do kind of checks like this. Like I have a helper function to check to see if it's kind of like a small mobile device. And in that case, for my views widget, which is this one, I either use a grid view, which is a built-in Flutter widget, or if the screen shrinks enough, you'll notice that I use, let me switch it over here. If it's small enough, I use a list view, right? So I kind of have some smarts baked into my UI code to kind of hopefully optimize for the screen space that is available. And I had images that I forgot about, my bad. And as you can see, this is it on an iPhone, on an Android phone, and on a tablet and an iPad. And I think it does a pretty good job of taking advantage of the screen real estate, regardless of the screen size. And you did see the full size web view as well, like the web browser view. There are, though, some signs that Flutter Web isn't your standard HTML website. So when you click and drag, when I click and drag, it scrolls, which is not, I think, typical point and click kind of browser type behavior. By default, text can't be highlighted. So I actually had to wrap some text in a selectable text widget. So notice it does highlight, and I can copy it, and I can click and drag. But there's some different behavior. Like normally when you double click a paragraph, it's supposed to highlight the whole paragraph, but it doesn't in Flutter Web. And notice I cannot highlight recent videos because I did not wrap it in selectable text widget. One other gap is you typically expect to be able to select across UI components on a website. You cannot do that even with the use of the selectable text widget. You are not able to do that on Flutter Web yet. So there's just some things that feel a little off with web. I mentioned accessibility being disabled by default. And then there's a few situations where typically on a website, when you have something clickable, you expect a little hand. And I was not getting the hand by default. I was getting the arrow. So small things you may not think about actually get a little weird unless you take some steps to kind of resolve them. This is just an example showing that I had to find this enable accessibility button when I had a VoiceOver on my Mac. And this is in the Safari browser. Once I was able to toggle this on, and I'm not super experienced with VoiceOver on Mac, but once I did toggle this button on, you can see that it was able to display different widgets and text across my website. So accessibility does work on Flutter Web. You just have that initial hurdle to get over to turn it on, and hopefully it'll be on by default in a future version. Here's an example of that mouse region. So before, for example, I made this tappable. So when you tap this, it would jump to the YouTube page for the video. By default, it was showing a pointer. But in order to get it to show a little hand, which you would expect on a website, I had to wrap it in a mouse region widget, which is a built-in Flutter widget. But I wish it would have just known, hey, it's in a gesture detector, automatically show the right icon. So I had to do some kind of manual steps there. Some people ask about SEO, so search engine optimization. It seems to be still a work in progress. It's actually a big complaint if you look at the Flutter open issues. I did a quick Google search for devcommunity.org, and it was able to pull out sign up for our newsletter. So it was able to, even though this web page is using a lot of Canvas, which is kind of one of the reasons why accessibility can be challenging and things like SEO can be challenging. It was able to at least pull that out of this page. I wish it would have also pulled this, and there are probably some things I need to do that I need to do some research on to make it work better. But I know this is a gap right now for websites, especially that rely on Google for discovery to be found. I also found a couple UI consistencies. So for example, I have a segmented control. If the screen width is small enough or narrow enough, I have a segmented control. It looks pretty good, except if you kind of zoom in a little on mobile, it looks clean. On web, there's this weird line break that I haven't, the code's exactly the same, and you would think that it would perform the same, but it doesn't. I haven't yet found a GitHub issue for this, but I might file one for it. Another thing is on web, you notice these nice rounded corners. For some reason, that exact same code running on mobile did not round the corners in the bottom left and bottom right. So I need to do some more investigation here, but part of the magic that you hear behind Flutter is hey, I'm gonna build this thing once and the UI is just gonna work like magic. I'd say it is pretty magical, but not completely magical yet. But I have high hopes for it given the speed at which Google has been moving and the updates that I've seen that come out fairly regularly. So I'm pretty hopeful that these rough edges will be smoothed out and it will kind of hit that magical moment where things are truly the same. And as I mentioned earlier, let's not forget Flutter Web is beta. This is very much called out on Google's Flutter docs, and they have a FAQ where you can note, you notice some things called out in the FAQ where how does copy and paste work on Flutter Web? Oh, well, it works on mobile. How do I internationalize a web app? TBD. That was in the FAQ. However, they did, with the update they made recently in the Medium article that they posted, they did kind of demonstrate the new way to do it, and it works across Flutter Web as well. So there are definitely some gaps, but it's definitely been a fun project to play with and publish and get out to the world. So what went well? Rapid development with hot restart. So this is similar to hot reload on Flutter Mobile. But ultimately, the idea is, you make a change and then it shows up pretty much almost instantly. It just makes for really quick iterations, and especially if this was a more mature project and I had a designer, I think there's a lot of benefit to sitting on in 2020, sitting on a Zoom call with the designer and them asking for changes and you just making them on the fly, and then you can kind of show them instantly without having to rebuild your application. I think that's super powerful. It was pretty easy to make something that looked decent or good with out-of-the-box widgets that were provided by the Flutter UI framework. Once I settled on an approach for responsiveness for the application, I found a pretty good rhythm and had a pretty good idea as I build out this website and add additional pages or screens. I have a pretty good idea of how to make sure that it looks good across screen sizes, whether they're mobile or desktop. For the most part, it just works across mobile and web. And of course, I didn't have to deal with my dreaded CSS. So that makes me happy. Some challenges, I talked about text selection, enabling accessibility, those minor inconsistencies across web and mobile. And then from a developer gap perspective, finding the best approach to responsive design. Hot reload is not as good. Sorry, hot restart is not as good as hot reload. Had some issues with integration test. And the last one we haven't really talked about is there's a pretty rich community of Flutter plugins. And originally they were pretty much, for Android and iOS. But more and more what you're seeing is plugins are being updated to add support for web. So if you truly want to make this work across web and mobile, and you want to use a third-party plugin, you do need to make sure that it supports web. And most of these are open source, so potentially you could help contribute back to them to add web support. But what I'm finding is more and more we're seeing web support, and then of course the big ones, those big plugins that come from Google, like all the Firebase plugins, do support web, which is a pretty awesome thing. So takeaways. I don't think Flutter Web is ready for prime time yet. It is in beta, but I think there's a ton of potential. And as I mentioned, the Flutter releases are moving at a very rapid pace. You should probably consider Flutter Web for pet projects, kind of like DevCommunity.org, or maybe you use it as an alternative to web views in your native Android applications instead of having a web view built out using HTML, CSS, JavaScript. And this might be for like non-essential parts of your mobile apps. And then of course, if you have a Flutter mobile app, definitely consider starting to test out how it looks on Flutter Web and see if there's any inconsistencies, and to get ahead of that, because one day, Google will push out that version that is supposed to be kind of production ready. And it's a beautiful thing if you've already kind of done some preliminary testing and you can kind of like ship that out to your users or customers when it does hit the kind of production ready point. So what's next? Personally, I want to jump into testing more, whether that's adding some Dart unit tests. I haven't written any widget tests. I need to jump into that more. And then I want to work on more integration tests, which are kind of these end-to-end automated tests. To prove that localization truly works, I want to localize the app in Spanish. Even if I'm using Google Translate, I want to make sure that adding a new ARB file in Spanish actually does work. And when you switch languages in the browser, that it truly does update the language in the on the screen. I want to think about do some refactoring to kind of move more magic numbers out into a constants file. I need to do some more of that. Think about mobile specific features. So right now there's not a lot of push to publish this to Google Play or the App Store, because there's not really any mobile specific capabilities that the application takes advantage of. So I do want to brainstorm some of that. I have been thinking about, like, what if our family of meetups, we could build some feature on devcommunity.org that would cater and provide some like interactive type features to that family of meetups that would be kind of like a benefit to attending those meetups. So more to come there. And if anyone has ideas, I'm super open to that. And as I mentioned, once it is worthy to publish, I would like to publish it to the App Store and Google Play, but just haven't had the time, and I don't think it's worth it just yet. So shout outs, definitely Android Summit team for organizing this amazing conference. Johnny Pepin he did some of the work to connect the devcommunity.org domain to my GitHub pages. Jared Sheehan for his leadership, and of course, massive community building efforts. He just popped on video. Hey, Jared. Ian Hirsch, he's another Capital One dev, and he actually helped mock up the devcommunity.org redesign. So thanks to him, and of course the rest of the DevCommunity core team for all their support and feedback. And I'd like to close by saying, like, remember, like, find your passion project. For me, this has just been really powerful and a really, really great way to kind of motivate me to spend that extra time to learn. So find that passion project, learn by doing, and of course share your knowledge. And it doesn't have to be in a big scary conference talk like this. It can be writing a blog post. It can just be telling another developer on your team, what you learned. So definitely, learn, and then definitely share what you learn. And as a reminder, DevCommunity.org is open source, so you can check out all the code. Code is definitely not perfect, and but I found it pretty fun to get this out there, because I think it does motivate me to write better code and to update it pretty regularly to know that other people might be looking at it. And as far as learning resources, a lot of my learning came from just tinkering, but also like Medium articles, as I mentioned. Flutter Dev has a very rich Discord community, and they're also on Reddit. And then of course, Google's official Flutter docs are a helpful resource as well. So other than that, thank you so much for your time. You can find me on Twitter @JaredAlexander, and then check out my website if you need to shoot me an email. But otherwise, Sean is the room host. I guess we can open it up to any questions. I don't see any I don't think I see any on the Zoom, but I wasn't sure if there's anything in the Slack channel.
Yeah, we've got some commentary in the Slack channel. I think it's similar to what's already in the chat, so you can follow up here or you can follow up there. I think I'm going to turn off the recording though.
Yeah.
Super appreciate you presenting, Jared. Fantastic
Yeah,
talk.
yeah. And thank you so much, Sean, for making this happen, and of course, Jared as well. Yeah, I mean, I'm